If you don't live in Germany, Austria or Slovenia, you are probably not familiar with this type of guitar. This is the famous Framus A.Z.10 archtop jazz guitar, and today we are going to restore it. It's one of the most popular guitar models for Oberkrainer music, or as we call it in Slovenia, narodno-zabavna glasba. They first came out in the 1960s as a signature model from Attila Zoller and were made until the 1970s. And the prices have only been skyrocketing since. Currently they are sold around 5,000 to 6,000 euros in good condition. This one is in a pretty rough condition, but we will change that. And a fun fact, it was actually made in West Germany, as you can see inside the label, so you know it's seen some history. The string height on the 12th fret is currently at 2.2 mm on the bass side and 2.5 mm on the treble side, which is a bit weird, but the problem is that the frets are all worn out and somebody was obviously trying to get rid of all the fret buzz that was going on. They also probably thought the buzzing noise was coming from the strings hitting the worn out bridge, so they put some plastic under the strings hoping to get rid of it. Before I do any fret work, I will remove all the moving parts from the guitar, as I will clean them on later anyways, and I think it's much easier to work with the neck when the machine heads are off the headstock. Up close you can really see that the frets are as beaten up as a drum kit at a punk show, technically still functioning but spiritually they are done. I'm using solder on the frets to quickly transfer the heat to the fret itself without heating up the fretboard too much, so that way when I pull them out I get as little tear out as possible. So now that I removed all of the frets, I will actually sand the fretboard while the neck is still attached to the guitar. Even though it's a bolt-on neck and I can remove it, I will only remove it when I install the new frets, because now it's much easier to work with the neck while it's on the guitar. I'll also be removing all the electronic parts with the pickup. And here you can actually see the abomination of cable patching someone did, which we will fix later on. For the life of me, I cannot figure out how somebody made this mount for the 9-volt battery, as it is really difficult to get it out. The problem is that the mounting system is attached under the neck, so if your battery runs out you cannot actually replace it easily, you have to remove the neck first, which is not an ideal situation. And now the battery actually fell inside the guitar, so we have to get it out. This wire right here is actually the grounding wire which broke off, which means the strings weren't even grounded. I will replace this rusty old input as well, and as a bonus, here's a piece of candy for you. Before I sand down the fretboard, the inlays need some touching up, some of them chipped out over the years, so the first thing I have to do is clean them out with some alcohol, and then with a sharp edge clean out all the gunk and the grease that's built up over the years. Then I will fill in all the voids of the inlays and apply a few drops of CA glue and wait for everything to dry before I sand everything down. There is no point in completely replacing the inlays, as they are still the original ones and only a few of them are actually chipped out. There was also a small hairline crack in the soundboard that didn't go all the way through, so I just applied some tight bond in there, wipe everything up and let it dry. Now that the inlays have all dried up, we can do the sanding and the leveling of the fretboard. I am adjusting the tension of the truss rod and measuring the relief in the neck before I sand everything. Here's a trick for you to make your fretboard really smooth. Before you fine sand everything down, you take a small piece of cloth and then you apply some water on the fretboard, not too much so you don't soak everything up, and then you let everything dry up, and this process should only take a couple of minutes. Here you can see the sped up version. After that, the wood fibers rose up, so the surface is now pretty rough, as you can hear. And now I will fine sand everything down so the surface is silky smooth and it feels really good when you bend the strings. I'm cleaning up the fret slots and making sure that they are the correct size for the fret wire that I will use. When you are installing the frets on a guitar, one of the most important things is to have the correct radius on the frets according to the neck. If you have too much fret radius, the frets will not sit properly in the slots and you will have a gap. But if you don't have enough radius on your fret wire, both ends of the fret can stick up, at which point it might be best to just redo everything over. Now I can remove the neck as I will be installing the frets, and there are some numbers on the back of the neck which looks like a toddler wrote it. It says a 2, 1 and probably an M, which I have no clue what it means. And here you can see the original screw holes for the pickup and the screw still in the neck. I am using a bit of tight bond in the fret slots before I hammer in the frets, as it cleans up really nicely and there's no traces of the glue, and it works as a gap filler in the slots. Also, if at any point down the road this guitar will need a refret, I am doing the next guy who will do this a huge favor, as it is much easier to remove the frets if they were installed with tight bond glue than CA glue. And when you're working with ebony, there's always a risk of tear up when you pull up the frets. If you look closely, there are some spots on the fretboard that I need to touch up and cover up, and we are doing the same process as we did with the inlays, but this time I'm using much thicker CA glue and sawdust from ebony, which matches the color of the fretboard. I'm using a sharp knife edge to get the glue in the gap and use as little as possible, and then I'm simply sprinkling on some sawdust and pushing it in and letting it dry. After everything dries up, I'm using a sharp chisel to get the bulk of the material off, and then I'm hitting it with extra fine steel wool to buff everything out. You can see that the spots that I touched up are practically invisible now. I am dressing the fret ends with a rough file first and then hitting it with 600 grit sandpaper before taking the sharp edges off with the fret end dressing file. I also finish off with a fine scotch pad as it rounds out the edges really nicely. Now it's time to level all of the frets and recrown them. I'm finishing off with an extra fine scotch pad, as I said earlier, before moving on to the next step of fret polishing. I'm going from 1000 to 8000 grit sandpaper. Now pay attention to one fret only and you will see how much it shines up when I'm going up the grit. I finish off the polishing process with extra fine steel wool before wiping everything down with alcohol. After all of the frets are leveled, it's time to install the 0 fret. The height of the 0 fret has to be slightly higher than the first fret, otherwise your strings will buzz when you play open notes. After you nail the height, it's the same process as with all of the other frets, dressing and polishing it up. Before I move to the next step of this repair, I need to clean out the saddle slot so that it sits perfectly when I install it back in. The string spacing of the old saddle is actually perfect, and I don't need to worry with the height of the saddle as the 0 fret solves this problem, so all I need to do is polish it up and place it back in. Looking at this headstock, you might be thinking to yourself, "Whoa, what a nice vintage satin finish this guitar has." Well, you are wrong. This is actually years and years of grease and sweat built on top of the existing lacquer. When this guitar was brand new, it came out in high gloss finish. Now, considering this is a nitrocellulose finish, we got quite a bit of work to do if we want to clean everything up and polish it up back to its old glory. Using a microfiber cloth and a lot of elbow grease, the top layer of dirt actually came off really nicely, but I will still need to polish it up with buffing compound on the polishing wheel. The worst part was at the end of the neck around the heel. There was so much dirt built up you couldn't ever tell this was originally a high gloss finish. When you are polishing up a guitar with nitrocellulose finish on the buffing wheel, you have to really be careful not to overheat it, otherwise you will melt the top layer, at which point you cannot get the shine back. I am really happy with how the polishing process turned out on this neck, as I think it kept all the original vintage mojo, but it also shines like it is brand new. Now that the neck and the frets are polished up, I can apply a coat of lemon oil to the fretboard and finish the refretting process. Usually I use linseed oil, but this time I went with lemon oil just because it smells a bit nicer. Cleaning up the machine heads and the metal parts is almost the same process as with cleaning the neck. First, I clean everything by hand with a microfiber cloth and rub it down so I remove all the grease. And then I remove all the hard stuck dirt and rust with a handheld Dremel tool using a soft steel wire attachment. Now it's just about mounting the machine heads back on the headstock and tightening everything up, and the neck is done, which means this concludes the first part of this repair, and now we can focus on the body of this guitar. Same as the neck, the body has a lot of dirt and sweat built on top of the lacquer, and I also think somebody spilled a sticky drink on top of the soundboard. Well, at least I hope it's a drink. I am removing this broken plastic pickup ring and I am saving it for later, as I will use it as a template to remake a new one. And now it's the same microfiber cloth and a lot of elbow grease before polishing up the body. Now let me tell you, cleaning up and polishing up the body was much more of a tedious process than I was expecting, and it took me hours to get done, but I'm very pleased with the final results. From afar, it actually looks like brand new. For the pickup ring, I'm using this black celluloid plastic, and I'm using the old one as a template and making some pilot holes, and this is where I messed up. I went too fast on the drill and I chipped out the pickup ring. Luckily I have enough material to make another one, and this time I went slower on the drill not to mess it up, and that did the trick. Now I'm just cutting out the center and using a sanding machine to make everything straight, and I'm using a mask here as nobody wants to breathe in any extra microplastics. I know what some of you might say here, the bandsaw blade is much too exposed for the cuts I am making. I know that. Please be careful when you are working with any kind of saw, as you can lose your fingers in a second if you're not careful enough. Before applying the glue, I need to roughen up the surface so that the glue has better grip, and I wait a few minutes so that the surface of the glue gets tacky, and then I press the pickup ring onto the soundboard and we are done. All of the electronic components on this guitar, from the pickup to the jack input and the 9-volt battery connector that you see, are not original. Somebody already did some modifications on this guitar, so there is no point in keeping these parts, and I will be replacing them for new ones. I will only be keeping the pickup. When you're soldering two connections together, always place the heat shrinking tube on top of it at the end so you don't have any exposed wires. I'm also replacing the two wires that went from the jack input to the connector and the pickup with one wire that has the hot, cold and ground in it, so it looks much cleaner. When you're patching two wires together, always put some solder on both ends, that way when you fuse them together you don't overheat the wire itself. And again, always put some heat shrinking tube on top of it. Now I just connect the hot, cold and ground wire to the stereo jack input, and then I can mount everything back on the guitar. Also, another great tip, whenever you are replacing the battery on your guitar, always write the date on top of it, and that way you know how many hours of playing that will get you, and you know exactly when to replace it so it doesn't die on you when you are on stage, for example. I am connecting the tailpiece to the jack input so that all of the strings are properly grounded, and I'm just coiling up the cable so that it acts as a spring and it doesn't rattle around inside the guitar. I also put a bit of solder and flatten up the end of the wire that will touch the tailpiece so that it sits as flush to the body as possible. Before I attach the tailpiece back on, I will polish it up the same as I did with the machine heads, and now I just place the neck back in and secure it in place. I also noticed for some strange reason that the tailpiece was mounted sideways and way out of center according to the neck. Luckily, the correct position of the tailpiece actually still covers up the old holes, so that is not a problem. The last thing I need to do before I put on the strings and set up this guitar is set the correct compensation for the intonation on the B string. I also sand down everything to 400 grit so that the bridge is nice and smooth, and I also put a protective coat of oil on top of it so that the bare wood is protected. Now I can put on the strings, set the correct neck relief, and place the bridge on the right position, move the intonation on the bridge forward, measure the height of the strings and make adjustments to correct it, cut off the excess strings, final tune-up, place the truss rod cover back on, and we are done with this restoration. Here are some before and after shots of this Framus A.Z.10 guitar restoration. And if you've made it this far in the video and liked what you saw, or if you learned something new, please consider subscribing here on YouTube or becoming a member here on YouTube or checking out the Patreon page. All of the links are in the description. It really does make a difference, and even a small contribution goes a long way in helping me make more of this type of videos. I played 2 sound demos at the end so you can hear what kind of music is played on this type of guitar. The first one is called Valček or Waltz in English, and it's in 3/4, and the second one is called Polka and it's in 2/4. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.